think we could begin. We got a lot of wonderful people out there. We want to welcome Richard Falk, of course, to the webinar. So nice to see you, and a lot of other people out there that are doing some really good work. So Brian, why don't you start the tape?
You are good to go when ready, Paul.
Okay. Ukraine war. What is going on? We're at a critical threshold right now in this war, as we seem to always be. We have these talks going on between Russia, the United States, Ukraine. Kind of confusing what's going on there. But a lot of key decisions are going to be made in this upcoming period. So here with us to help us shed light on what is going on tonight is Scott Horton. Scott is director of the Libertarian Institute and editorial director of the online written publication Antiwar, which many of us look at on a regular basis. And he is the host of the Scott Horton Show podcast. Over the last, I think it's like 22, 23 years, Scott has conducted more than 6,000 interviews. He is the author of a number of several books. I'll mention a couple of the more recent ones. For instance, his new book is Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and Brought Catastrophe to Ukraine. That was just released recently. A few years ago, the book Enough Already: Time to End the War on Terrorism. And the last one I'll mention is Fool's Errand: Time to End the War in Afghanistan. That book was published in 2017. So let us get into our program. Scott, we really appreciate you spending time with us this evening and helping us to clarify what in the world is going on in Ukraine and between Trump, Russia, and Ukraine in these talks. Welcome, Scott.
Sure. Thank you very much, Paul, for having me, and for all of you for showing up here tonight to give a listen. I'm very appreciative of it. As Paul mentioned, my latest book is called Provoked, and I published it last November, just after the election. It's now 5 months running as #1 in War and Peace on Amazon.com, although with an exception of a couple weeks after Jimmy Carter died and Dave Chappelle talked about his book Peace Not Apartheid on the Saturday Night Live. So, but other than that, though, 5 months at #1 in War and Peace. You can check the Amazon reviews before you buy it, see what they thought. But essentially what happened was, as he said in the subtitle, it's how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. So the war comes at the end of the book, obviously, in the Biden years. But the book begins with H.W. Bush, and I go through each chapter as a president, just going through all the different things they did, essentially, to screw over the Russians since the end of the last Cold War and set us on this chart, chart us on this path, I guess. So the book is called Provoked. It's not called Justified and let's all celebrate Russia's, belligerence or anything like that. It's called Provoked because, of course, this was in the West, the governments and the media's, major narrative was this was an unprovoked attack. And they repeat it so many times. It was like they were trying to hypnotize you, where you're just supposed to never question then what anyone could have possibly done to help to have make this happen in any way. All you need to know about it is that you don't need to know anything except that Putin decided to do this because of how bad he is. And we'll start with that. And so I was actually terrified that somebody was going to publish a book with that same title before me, because it's such an obvious and awesome title for a book about this war. But I got it done first. But essentially, and I think everybody, watching this tonight is, largely familiar with the narrative, and that is that the PNAC crew, the American foreign policy establishment, but led by the neoconservatives, the vanguard of the war party, of course, the same people who insisted on all of our Middle East chaos over the last 25 and 30 years, are the same people who led the way for NATO expansion, and for that matter, the expansion of American dominance, not just through Eastern Europe, but throughout the world. And, to them, anything less than American world domination is chaos. And so, there's a lot of cynicism and a lot of money making and a lot of power flexing, but there's a lot of self-justification on the side of the American war party too, in that, typical arrogant, thing where the shining city on the hill is indistinguishable from a laser designator guiding a bomb to a target. It's all basically the same difference as long as it's the middle part of North America doing it, is the way that they look at it. And so it would be betraying Eastern Europe to not bring them all into our alliance, even though that's actually putting them in danger. It's making it more likely that they would be in a violent conflict with their perennial threat, the Russians, to their east, by bringing them into a blatantly anti-Russian military alliance right at a time when everybody's friends again and nobody has a reason to fight anymore because the commies are all dead and gone and everybody's getting along. So, and the thing of it is that the people who were in charge of the policy over this entire period of time, they knew better, and then they did it all anyway. And they all, from people like Brent Scowcroft, who worked for H.W. Bush, and all the way through in the Bill Clinton years and in the W. Bush years and in the Obama years, people inside the administration agreed with me and said, boy, we shouldn't be doing this. This is sure is going to be provocative and hope the Russians don't react too bad. And then they go ahead on and do it anyway. And it's the same story all the way through. So I know we want to save a lot of time for questions and things like that. And also to talk, very current events post-Trump's election here and inauguration. So I'll try to just, briefly summarize the Cold War stuff and then just skip to the war. So the Cold War stuff essentially is yes, they did promise not to expand NATO. And I know that they say that that's been debunked, but I've rebunked it. It's completely true that they promised over and over again. James Baker himself 6 times in one day, but the prime ministers of Britain, Thatcher and Major, the Chancellor of Germany, Kohl, and his foreign minister, Genscher, and all of these guys over and over and over again promised. In fact, H.W. Bush himself promised not to take advantage of Soviet withdrawal from Eastern Europe and allowing the Warsaw Pact to dissolve. And so, but essentially what they promised was, first, they wouldn't expand NATO. And then second, it wouldn't matter anyway, because we're going to abandon NATO as a military organization. It's not going to be an alliance. We don't need an alliance because there's no enemy. So what we're going to do is we're going to make NATO a political organization, which they implied something like the EU plus America. And its military role would be handed over to the CSCE, or the OSCE as it's now called. And then later into the Clinton years, they said the Partnership for Peace. And Russia would be included in the same so-called security architecture with the United States and the rest of the Eastern European states all at once. Or as William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, proposed it, well, if we are going to keep NATO the dominant military force, then we should bring Russia in first. Then when we bring in these Eastern European countries, it'll be understood that essentially everybody's neutrality is baked in here. Nobody's versus anybody here because we're all members together, this kind of thing. Now, I'm not favoring that. I am, completely for independence and non-interventionism. And certainly at the end of the old Cold War, we should have, I believe, abolished NATO and the entire American world empire and just come home entirely, cash that peace dividend, and try to be a normal country in a normal time, as Gene Kirkpatrick said. But anyway, this was the debate going on there, is do we expand NATO at Russian expense, where we're not erasing the dividing lines in Europe, but merely moving it east and closer to Russia? Or are we going to find a way to incorporate them into what we're doing to a degree that they don't feel threatened by what we're doing, which would lead to, as they put it then, a self-fulfilling prophecy where we need this military alliance to protect from Russia, who we just turned back into an enemy by expanding our military alliance. So they all knew what they were doing at the time. And even hawks like Richard Holbrooke in the Bill Clinton years, who had really helped to push the thing through as the loudest guy in the room, always, as well as Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. These were not the people who were against expansion. These were the people who were for it the most, who pushed it through and who advocated for it the loudest. And of course, with Brzezinski and Kissinger with the most kind of gravitas as these international policy grandmaster theoreticians and all this stuff. Even they said, well, of course, we'll have to make a special exception for Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, will have to be on the Austria model or the Finland model from the Cold War. They'll have to be on a permanent basis of neutrality. Because if we try to fight over dominance in Ukraine, rather than just letting them be neutral and independent, then that will guarantee a fight with Russia. Now, the Baltics are different. Even though they're right there on the Russian border, they just have a different history and a different ethnicity and different, just historical ties between the two. There's a very Russian city in eastern Estonia that you might argue is really a Russian city. But for the rest of them, it's really not. It's really a separate issue. Whereas in Ukraine, you have this huge, heavily Russian, not just Russian speaking, but ethnic Russian and semi-recently Russian national population going back a few generations. But this made it, an extremely delicate issue, and especially considering the fact that the Russians controlled this all-important naval base at Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, which is, one, their only year-round warm water port, but also their direct access to the Black Sea and therefore the Mediterranean and, presumptions of regional power at least. And so this was a controversy, and it was known to be a controversy all along. And even the expander said we have to be ultra careful about this. Now, there are other issues in the 1990s, particularly the terrible shock therapy economic policy, which the libertarians here will agree with me and the leftists will be appalled to hear was a lack of free market principles being exported into the Russian system rather than too much too soon. And so because of all the cronyism and communism left in the system is, and which the American Harvard boys helped to, aid and abet and solidify. I mean, from my point of view, you can understand, even you leftists listening could understand why an Austrian school guy like me would say, well, at least send the Chicago school guys. But instead, they sent the Harvard boys, which just means a bunch of Bill Clintonite liberal Democrats who never understood the first thing about free market principles. They had, as non-leftists, they'd made their peace with business. But that doesn't mean that they understand real free market principles or that that was what they were really trying to export to Russia. They weren't, and they blew it. And they really, imagine a communist economy turning to a free economy and a few million people die as a result because of the absolute collapse of the standard of living there. That was because of the cronyism and corruption of the American exported system to Russia in the Bill Clinton years. It's really something to behold, that entire story. And then, of course, the Balkan Wars were at the expense of their allies, the Serbs, and completely unreasonable in the case of Bosnia and in Kosovo. I give thorough treatments to both wars in the book. And just, probably 2/3 of the reason the Americans were even involved was to solidify the strength of NATO as the dominant military force on the continent. Not Germany, USA will be dominant there, and by making sure to take the driver's seat and the leadership position on this important conflict as it was playing out. Was a huge part of the intervention there, a huge part of why they made it worse so they'd have a problem to solve. And again, in both cases, absolutely humiliating the Russians and their position. They had promised when they expanded the first 3 countries into NATO in 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, they said, listen, you Russians got to stop whining about this. It's a defensive alliance, okay? Defensive alliance. Then 3 weeks later, Once the ink was dry and they held the big ceremony, 3 weeks later, they launched an aggressive war against Serbia to break off its province, Kosovo, on a completely false pretext of a genocide that never took place. It was this fictional Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, or Gaddafi's genocide in Benghazi, or any of the rest of these paper-thin lies that they pushed to justify these wars. And this was really a major turning point in the destruction of America's relationship with Russia. And Boris Yeltsin screamed at Bill Clinton on the phone for 12 minutes and then slammed the phone down on him. And Prime Minister Chernomyrdin turned his plane around over the Atlantic Ocean. And the Western suck-ups, basically, the so-called democratic reformers who wanted the most to get along with the United States and who wanted the most to transform the Russian political and economic system in a Western direction as much as possible. They were the ones who cried and lamented and said, oh man, you have no idea how bad you screwed us here. We said you were cool, and then you did this. And so it just completely discredited them and completely discredited us in the eyes of the Russian people. And there were opinion polls where they had it where the Russian people in 1998 gave American approval rating of like 68%. And then in 1999, it was down to 10% or something like that because of the Kosovo War, which was a small tangent, but it was completely in violation of the absolute BS made up international law that they made up as an excuse to intervene in Bosnia, where they said that the Bosnian Serbs can't break away from Bosnia in order to stay in Yugoslavia because, nope, the new nation of Bosnia, which we just recognized, owns them now. And even though Bosnia has the right to secede from Yugoslavia, the Bosnian Serbs have no right to secede from Bosnia. Well, on that same principle, then, the Kosovar Albanians don't have the right to secede from Serbia. And yet they do, because why? Because that's what Bill Clinton says. That's what his wife says. And so off to war we go. And with no authority from Congress or the UN Security Council or anything else. And anyway, so then W. Bush comes in and just ruins everything as best as he possibly can. You know, Putin's the first one to call him oh, and I should have mentioned, this is truly important, and I cover this thoroughly in the book, that in the Bill Clinton years, even though the bin Ladenites had been attacking us since 1992 at the Radisson Hotel in Yemen, and then, of course, the World Trade Center bombing in 93, Americans training the Saudi National Guard in 95, the Khobar Towers attack in 96, the failed Bojinka plot against Bill Clinton and Pope John Paul in 1995, and the planes operation there that had failed there. But then the Africa Embassy attack of 1998, the USS Cole in 2000, Bill Clinton was still backing these terrorists anyway, the whole time. The same group, not just the Afghan Mujahideen, but the international Islamic brigades of particularly what they called the Arab Afghans, who had gone to fight in Afghanistan in the 1980s for Rambo 3 and all that. They went then on to Bosnia, to Kosovo, and to Chechnya, where Bill Clinton and John Major and then Tony Blair and the kings, Abdullah and Fahd and Abdullah and the rest in Saudi Arabia, backed the terrorists. And at one point, the Chechen terrorists even complained to Osama bin Laden, we don't understand why you want to attack the United States. They've been so good to us. They backed us in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo. Now they're backing us in Chechnya. Why would you want to attack them? And bin Laden said, of course, there's a broader vision here. You don't understand, but that's why I'm the boss, not you, et cetera. And so went on ahead because his grievances were broader than just these battlefields, right? And so, and this is also part of why America turned a blind eye to the oncoming attack, was because like when Colleen Rowley and the people in Minneapolis wanted to search Zacarias Moussawi's computer, they said this guy's tied to the terrorists in Chechnya, and FBI headquarters said, the terrorists in Chechnya aren't terrorists. They're our friends. We like them. They're freedom fighters and nationalists and good guys. And so that's not enough to get a FISA warrant against this guy. And if they had got their fight, when eventually they did get their warrant, they found papers in his pockets and on his in his apartment that traced directly to the plot leaders, Ramzi bin al-Shibh and Mohammed Atta. So they could have stopped September 11th if they hadn't been palling around with these kooks in Kosovo and in Chechnya. And in fact, in August of 2001, Delta Force trained KLA terrorists, the Kosovo Liberation Army, bin Ladenite terrorists, invaded Macedonia, trying to create a greater Kosovo, and then were routed. This is in August of 01, a month before the attack. And and the Macedonian forces routed them and forced them out, and the Americans came and transported them out of there. So that's the kind of double game that they were playing. And it's part of why the attack was successful, is because these guys think they know what they're doing, but they don't, not very well. So then, so W. Bush comes in. Putin calls W. Bush on September 11th and says, hey, I'm your humble servant. You want to use my bases and the stands to invade Afghanistan? I'll give you all the logistics, all the intelligence I have on the Taliban, everything I can to help you with your war. It was America that was switching sides in the Afghan war, not Russia. So he was perfectly happy to help us, right? And then what do? W. Bush, two months later, he tears up the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And this is it sounds silly because, of course, we want to be able to shoot down ballistic missiles. But the thing of it is it was just part of the arms race. And the more anti-missile missiles we make, the more pro-missile missiles they make. And it just goes forever. So Nixon and them decided way back 50 years ago, let's just call a halt to this, because there's got to be a limit to this brinksmanship. When we got up to 70,000 total H-bombs on missiles in the world, something's got to give. And so this is where they started to compromise. And W. Bush tore that up. And I'll get right back to that in a second. But it's important that when he did tear that up, it ruined the START II treaty. And the Russians had already signed it and ratified it. And when W. Bush tore up the ABM treaty, the Russians then backed out of the START II treaty as well. And START II banned multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRV. In other words, one bomb, one rocket, instead of up to 24 or more, however many, multiple warheads per one ICBM. So that may have been the worst decision that any two men ever made in the history of mankind, is W. Bush and Vladimir Putin destroying that START II treaty. Is just absolutely unforgivable negligence on their part for whatever narrow interest that they thought could possibly be more important than that. Anyway, so then W. Bush, he does this in order to begin. It took a long time to get it all done, but to install what's called Aegis onshore, or essentially American anti-missile missiles in Romania, Poland, and with the radars in the Czech Republic. And this is a threat to the Russians. Mostly, I'll skip the whole story here, but mostly because they're dual-use launchers. So first of all, they're raising the potentiality of being able to shoot down a Russian retaliatory strike and gain a first strike capability that way, even though they really don't have enough missiles for that. But they launched their Sparrow defensive missiles from what are called the MK-41 or Mark 41 missile launchers that can also hold Tomahawk cruise missiles, and those can be tipped with H-bombs. And so they were in violation of the spirit of the INF Treaty, if not the direct letter of it, by doing this. And all they had to do was invite some Russian captain to sit there and be an inspector on a permanent inspection regime and make everybody feel safe. But they didn't want to do that. And when Putin said, Bush said, this is for Iran, to protect Poland from Iran, that doesn't have missiles that can reach Poland, has no beef with Poland, and doesn't have nukes. And so what are you talking about? And Putin said, well, look, let's just do this together. We'll have a joint anti-missile base and we'll put it in Azerbaijan, you know, where it'll be useful. In adjacent to Iran there. And Bush's like, nah, we're not doing that. So he said, why don't you put it in Iraq? What'd you invade that country for anyway? Why don't you put your anti-missiles there and hem in Iran from there? No, got to put them in Poland, he says. All right. So this is, you know, been a major contention because, again, I mean, I'm sure as you guys can tell, they're lying, right? That's BS. It's about protecting Poland from Iran. It has something to do with Russia. If it's not shooting down a retaliatory strike, maybe it is to have an excuse to put those dual-use launchers there. They don't have a more plausible explanation than that for. Then W. Bush also expands NATO by bringing 7 more countries in. He launches wars without the UN Security Council, which, again, to reiterate, is not my problem, but it is certainly a threat to the so-called world order and the agreement that America has with the other major powers that it's illegal to start a war if you can't get the UN Security Council to agree to start the war. And so here, Bill Clinton went around them for Kosovo. W. Bush did the same for Iraq. And in other words, taking these major steps to undermine the so-called rule of law in the world, when after all, it's an anarchic system of nation states who these treaties are really, you know, simply voluntary with no overriding controlling authority, as Al Gore would say, to enforce them. And so America's doing a lot to disrupt that system during the W. Bush years. And then I want to make sure, I almost did forget, the many color-coded revolutions. Now, this started under Bill Clinton in the Balkans, and especially with the bulldozer revolution against Milosevic in 1999 in Serbia. In 2000 in Serbia. But then when W. Bush comes in, he does the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, in 2005 he does the failed, first of all, the successful Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, and then in Serbia, the sort of half-failed, half-successful Cedar Revolution, and the failed Denim Revolution in Belarus. That's all in 2005. And all of these are essentially, well, not so much the Lebanon one, but the rest of them are, clearly about undermining Russian interests, and they're near abroad. And if we don't have compliant and friendly governments in these countries, we'll just take them. And they always say that they're bolstering and supporting democracy. They're clearly doing everything they can to pick winners and losers. And they have, somewhat ingeniously decided on this policy of dressing up revolutions or dressing up coup d'etats to look like local revolutions. And they hire youth groups and give them a ton of money to build up their numbers and for all their propaganda and graffiti and all their organization. They will come in and make sure to bring all the other opposition candidates together and force all of them to drop out and support one guy. And all of this, is a huge amount of foreign meddling in these other countries and trying to make it look like it's just a expression of democratic spirit. And if you criticize it all, they go, "Oh, you deny the agency of the people on the ground." Like, whether you lean left or right, imagine whichever one you dislike more, the Tea Party or the Occupy movement. Imagine if the Chinese or the Russians came in and poured tens of millions of dollars into their anti-U.S. policy, U.S. government protest movement. We would absolutely not tolerate that at all. And they do this to the tens of millions of dollars in all these countries. It's a huge problem. And help to really, again, spoil relations between the United States and Russia. And then the worst thing that W. Bush did on this issue is the Bucharest Declaration of 2008. So first of all, I hope, I'm sure many of you in this room have heard of the Niet means Niet memo. If you haven't, it's really important. I do hope you'll go and look it up. It's on wikileaks.org, and it's a fun and compelling read. What the hell can I say? I don't know. It's from the end of February 2008, and you'll know him as Biden's CIA director, William Burns, the guy who he sent in Tony Blinken's place a lot of the time, since Blinken was such an absolute, derelict as Secretary of State. He would send the CIA director to go do diplomacy a lot. But anyway, this guy had been stationed at the American Embassy even in the 1990s and was the ambassador to Russia in the W. Bush years. And here he wrote this memo to Condoleezza Rice, where he says, "Listen, I polled everybody in Moscow, okay?" And he says, from the most enlightened liberals to the most reactionary knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin, okay? I talked to them all. I talked to the guys at the think tanks, and I talked to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. And what he said was, "Man, don't do this. Man, don't put me in this position. This is the brightest of all red lines for Russia if you bring Ukraine, especially Georgia too, but Ukraine into NATO." He goes, "This is such a delicate issue and you have to understand the situation in Ukraine. This could cause a civil war in Ukraine. And then Russia would be forced to have to make a decision whether or not to intervene. A decision we do not want to have to make." Right? So this is as close as Sergei Lavrov gets to begging. Right? Listen to me, Burns. Don't do this, man. Don't put me in this position. You see? And Burns is saying to Rice, the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, not Susan Rice, that's later. He's saying to Condoleezza Rice, "Listen, we shouldn't do this. Like, this is unanimous. This isn't Vladimir Putin, and this isn't him and his 4 right-wing friends. This is the entire consensus in Moscow, is that this is just absolutely an intolerable provocation. They'll be forced to react. It'll be a huge problem." He says in his memoirs he thinks Condoleezza Rice agreed with him. Now, I don't know what she told him. I guess I didn't read her memoir if she has one. I don't know what she told W. Bush. But Burns says that he thought that and he even wrote in quotes in his memoir, another email that he wrote to her, just emphatic about this. So he says in his memoir that he thought that she agreed with him. Again, we don't know what Gates told Bush, but the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, presumably said this to Bush because he slammed him in his memoir, in his second book. He says, oh, this is the most irresponsible overreach and all these things, and uses, Hortonian language against Bush to castigate him for this major blunder, this absolute overreach, he says. And then we also know that Burns said the entire, in his memoir, says the entire embassy in Moscow agreed with him. And then we also know from Fiona Hill, and this is funny to me because Fiona Hill now says that if you believe this, then you're a victim of a Russian psychological warfare campaign. And yet she's the one who told this story like 5 times. Well, okay, I'm exaggerating, 3 times at least that I know of. Presumably it's in her book, but she told it to the New York Times twice, including one time in their weekend magazine, where they make a whole scene out of it, where she's warning W. Bush that she and the entire National Security Council, and she was the head of the Ukraine desk, and we know that Thomas Graham was the head of the Russia desk, and we know he was a dove. He was way better than her on all this stuff. So if she was good on it, he was better. No question about that. And she says the entire National Security Council agreed with her. And what had they done? They had polled the intelligence community, and the CIA and everybody else had reported back the same thing. We shouldn't do this. And so she then told that to Bush. And she says that Dick Cheney got all mad and stormed out of the room, and that Bush said, go ahead, little lady, tell your story. And then, and this, I believe this because it just sounds so perfectly like W. Bush, that he says that it's a matter of diplomacy between him and Germany and France, and he thinks that he can convince them. In other words, he dismisses her argument that it's Russia's concerns that we need to be concerned about. Instead, he changes the subject to France and Germany's concerns about Russia's concerns, and he says, don't worry, I'll be able to overcome that obstacle. Right? Like he's got rocks in his ears. He's not listening to what she's telling him about the Russian reaction, which is the French and the Germans' anticipated problem here. And we know that what happened was that Angela Merkel put her foot down and absolutely refused to let him give them an official membership action plan. So he only announced the so-called Bucharest Declaration, announcing that this is going to happen someday. So like a quarter-assed invitation, if not a half-assed one, for Ukraine to join the NATO alliance. In other words, getting them in deep trouble with their next-door neighbor while not offering to protect them in any way, the worst of all worlds. And then Burns says, why did he do this in his memoir? He says, and this goes to us libertarians and the public choice theory, right, is that there's no national interest. There's only the interests of the individuals in charge of making the decisions. And this, George W. Bush did this for George W. Bush because it was as Burns called it, a legacy building operation for him. Because see, Iraq War II was supposed to be his legacy, but that was a total disaster. Only the Ayatollah and Osama bin Laden and Ariel Sharon benefited from that. No Americans benefited from it at all, except Lockheed stockholders. And so then he wanted to privatize Social Security and take all the Social Security IOUs and put them in the stock market bubble, the same one that crashed at the end of 2008. Remember that? Well, the old people wouldn't let him get away with that. And so what was his legacy? It was nothing, right? The Department of Homeland Security. And a million people dead. And so he had to do one more big thing in his last year in office so that people would remember him for something big, right? Like when they say somebody the great, they don't necessarily mean great like you mean great. They mean great like the Great War, the horrible thing where 22 million people died. Great just means big. That's the kind of great that W. Bush is. Yeah, he's big, all right. None of this was for the benefit of the American people or protected our national interests whatsoever, right? This absolute arrogant idiot. To think that he was in charge of the world empire beginning the first month of the 3rd millennium is just the greatest irony in the history of all of history. But so then Barack Obama comes, he humiliates the Russians with his Libya war, which he lied them into abstaining on the Security Council and allowing them to do by invoking this pretended genocide. And he did a lot of other things, but most and worst was he supported the second overthrow of the government of Ukraine in 10 years in the so-called Revolution of Dignity. And I want to belabor this a little bit just because there's so much mis and misunderstanding about this and the way people talk about it. So I like to clarify a couple things. First of all, I'd like to recommend to you guys all watch this wonderful interview of Paul Manafort on the Patrick Bet David show. And I should have just interviewed the guy myself years ago. I don't know why I didn't. But so Paul Manafort is notoriously a political advisor to tyrants around the world. I mean, he had a real unseemly reputation from the 80s and the 90s. Him and Roger Stone and a couple of these other guys, they're, you know, pretty cutthroat Republican political consultants, right? So he gets a job working for this guy, Yanukovych, from the Party of Regions in Ukraine, to help him get elected in 2010, which he did. He was the same guy that Bush had prevented from taking power in 2004. And but the people who won that day were humiliated and crushed quickly due to their own corruption and mismanagement of the country after that. So this guy had come back again. But Manafort explains, and this is totally believable to me because, first of all, Your Honor, just look at him. The guy, you know, if he's not CIA, well, then he could be and should be. But he clearly, you know, would fit in with their social class, you know, with the fancy cufflinks and all this stuff. Like he's one of those type of guys that you, right, not like an FBI agent, but like a CIA officer type of a guy. You know, big talker type, as so many of them are. But so he explains all this to Patrick Bet David. He goes, listen, the Eastern oligarchs hated Russia and they wanted out from under Russia's thumb. They were the redheaded stepchild to the Russian oligarchs. So the Eastern Ukrainian oligarchs, they wanted to move west and join the EU. Part of it was because they're so corrupt, the country's so corrupt that whenever a new guy becomes president, he'll steal your company and give it to his brother-in-law and this kind of stuff, which is so out of the bound of the rules of what you can get away with in the EU. You'd have to temper that stuff to join the EU, and they preferred that. They wanted to take a chance on joining up with that kind of stability. So it was the Eastern, they go, oh, the pro-Russian party. No, it was the Eastern party, the Party of Regions that wanted to move west. And that was why they wanted Yanukovych, and he also wanted the same thing. And after Manafort helped him win, the first place they went was to Brussels, not to Moscow, which is a huge symbol of what they were trying to do. And Reuters has great reporting about this from the fall of 2013 as well, where Yanukovych shouted down his cabinet and said, shut the hell up. I'm the boss, and I say we're moving west here. We're signing the deal with the EU, and I'm not going to hear any more crap from you about it. But then what happened was, and this is according to George Soros and Henry Kissinger, and when they agree with me, that means I'm definitely right by the rules of confirmation bias from evil, horrible people who agree with me. And so what they said was it was all Angela Merkel's fault. She ruined it. She was the Chancellor of Germany, was the leader of the EU negotiations, and she played too hard of hardball. She wouldn't give them anything but the barest enough of a loan to roll over their debt from last year, while inflicting a severe austerity program. You're going to have to cut all your pensions and your gasoline subsidies for the poor and all of these type of things and get essentially nothing for it. Putin was also playing hardball, and he had contradicted himself in public. He said, you can have an agreement with us too and them, but in private, he was telling them, no, if you sign with them, you don't get a deal with me. And he's next door, and he's the bigger power, and he was offering them a $15 billion loan at a low interest rate. And a break on their debts in paying gas royalties and all whatever it was, money they owed from stealing natural gas from the Russians. And so Yanukovych essentially had no choice. And so it's Soros and Henry Kissinger both blamed Merkel and said it was absolutely her ham-handed diplomacy here. I believe it was Kissinger who said, listen, if you were really serious about this, you want to bring Ukraine into the EU, and there's even parts about normalizing their military force to get them ready to join NATO in the association agreement. He goes, if you're going to do something like this in the real world, it would be the result of years of consultation and negotiation with all parties concerned, including the Russians. This is the most amateurish type diplomacy that absolutely blew up in their face. Perhaps it was meant to, perhaps it wasn't. But when Henry Kissinger denounces your negotiations for failing that badly and leading to such a catastrophe, then yeah, it's pretty clear that it's not just because the other side was evil, because Kissinger would have mentioned that, well, you know, the Russians are evil, so you have to take that into account. But he had left that out of his entire thing. It was just a matter of national interests on all sides, and the sides representing the West blew it. And then, but so what happened then was there was a somewhat organic protest movement that broke out. I mean, the guy who announced it worked for Homdrasky TV, which was financed by USAID, the NED, and George Soros, and the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute. I mean, they were Western sock puppets, were the ones who announced the protest. But then thousands of people did show up, and then the government, you know, in fact, they're including Nazis who engaged in violence from the very first day. Then the government stupidly cracked down too hard and led to a reaction, and more people came, and they essentially, the same as in the Orange Revolution, the Western governments and, you know, pseudo government NGOs came in there with tens of millions of dollars to finance this giant carnival of protests that lasted for the whole winter through all of December of 2013 and through January and February of 2014, until they could push through essentially a deal whereby Yanukovych would fire his entire government and hire all their guys to run his government, and then he would stand for an early election before the end of the year. And when the protest leaders went up on the stage and announced that they had a deal, the Nazis in the crowd announced that we don't respect your deal. And there was a guy named Parasyuk, who, as I show in the book, is the same guy who admitted and boasted to the media and was identified by multiple major media outlets, including the BBC, as being the leader of the snipers shooting police from the Music Conservatory that morning. Same guy. He later became a member of parliament. His name was Parasyuk. And he jumped up on the stage and he grabbed the microphone and he said, you guys are sellouts and traitors, and we don't respect your deal. We don't respect any deal where the president gets to stay in office. And in fact, if he doesn't leave town by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, I'm going to kill him myself. And this is a guy who'd already been killing cops all day and for the last couple of days. And so, yeah, it was believable. And then, as Andrew Kramer from the New York Times said, this was believable. And the whole crowd started chanting, yes, yes, let's kill him, etc. And then, but see, part of the deal was he would pull his police forces back and they would end the protest. But of course, they didn't respect that. They kept the protest going, but his security forces did pull back. And then I'm not exactly sure what caused them to simply just abandon all government buildings in Kiev that next day, either a well-placed bribe or they just saw their leadership get out of town. And so they just jumped on buses and left too, or, felt like they were being hung out to dry or something. So just all the beat cops, all the security cops, all just fled. And then, led by the Nazis, the protesters seized all the government buildings. They impeached the president while a bunch of stormtroopers were marching up and down the aisles of the parliament with rifles. And they didn't have the proper number of members of parliament to even vote on the thing, where they impeached the president. And America recognized the new coup d'etat junta the next day, after they drove the guy out of town. Then Putin, of course, a few days later, seized the Crimean Peninsula in a coup de main, where only 6 people were killed, 2 soldiers on each side and 2 civilians. But the Marines and the sailors just essentially went outside and took control of the peninsula. And then in the East, there were a bunch of protesters who essentially mimicked what the Western protesters had done, which was, occupying the government buildings, and refusing to recognize the rule of the new regime. But when they did that, the new Kiev government, encouraged by the United States, I think overreacted severely. They say that this was all Russian sock puppetry, but I think that that is not true. As I show in the book, there were Russian agents who came and showed up, but they really were rushing to get ahead of a parade that was already going on. And there were, thousands and thousands of protesters. So let's not deny their agency, guys, as they were taking over these buildings. But they had not committed any overt act of war. The worst thing they'd done is occupy a federal police building or two. And then the government in Kiev went to war against them. And they used the neo-Nazi militias to lead the way. And so then, I don't know the proportion, but a significant proportion of the military then defected to the other side. And this is what led to the outbreak of war. And the spin at the time was Russia had simply invaded, and this was a whole Russian thing, and there were no rebels. It was all Russians, and it was all Russian equipment and all of this stuff. But that was totally debunked. And as I show in the book, even C.J. Chivers from the New York Times, who is a Marine Corps captain and a munitions expert went over there and verified that these are Soviet weapons that were given to the Ukrainian military 30 years ago. They're not Russian weapons that have just been infiltrated across the line. And the Conflict and Armaments Reporting NGO reported the same thing, et cetera, like that. And we know that what happened was John Brennan, who's the same guy who led al-Qaeda forces in Syria, a little slightly tongue-in-cheek there, for Barack Obama, and the same guy who framed Donald Trump for treason in the Russiagate scandal. He went to Kiev and on April the 12th, and then 2 days later, on the 14th, they launched the war against the people of the east of the country. And so it's clearly at Barack Obama's behest that they did that they launched this war. And then that's the war that essentially lasted until 2022, when Putin escalated it so drastically. But the Russians intervened in August of 14 and again in February of 15 to force through the Minsk peace deals, which, you know, it's kind of difficult to explain that the peace deals essentially, they were meant to call a ceasefire, but what they only succeeded in doing really was ending the role of heavy munitions, airstrikes and tanks, and invasions by armed brigades across lines, essentially, like the heaviest fighting. But there's still ongoing artillery war back and forth for years, the whole time. So it was, to help understand, it was 9,000 killed in the first year, and then another 4,000 killed over the next 7 years, if that makes sense. And so it's mostly skirmishes between fighters, but you know, some civilians caught up in that as well. And I know that it's Russian propaganda that there are Nazis on the Ukraine side, but there are Nazis on the Ukraine side, real bad ones, and ones directly descended from the actual Nazis that served Hitler's forces in the Second World War. As I show, I beat the dead horse beyond any reason in the book, because it's supposedly at least an extraordinary claim. So I show the extent of this. And it's not that they're a major voting majority in the country. This is often trotted out as like this red herring argument, that they're, you know, have this mass raw voting power. They don't, but they have outsized political influence, and especially because of their role in the armed forces. First of all, making things worse and making sure there's a war to fight, and then leading the fight in it. And, you know, right now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Azov Battalion, which grew right out of the same Nazi groups that had done the putsch in the Maidan. They then formed this Azov Battalion to go to war with the Russian-backed rebel forces in Mariupol back in 2014 and related areas. Well, their leader, Andriy Beletsky, is one of the major leaders of the Ukraine war effort right now. And the Azov Battalion became the Azov Brigade, and then it was renamed the 3rd Separate Infantry Division, and it was also split off. There's part of the National Guard that's the 12th Special Infantry of the National Guard, are a separate Azov breakoff. But Beletsky and his group, they became known as the 3rd Separate Infantry Division, and they're now the 3rd Army Corps. They've been made the 3rd Army Corps, and Beletsky is still their leader. And he's the guy, if you've ever seen this, they beat this quote to death. So if you're familiar at all, you'll recognize this is the guy who said that we must lead the white race in the crusade against the Semitic-led Untermenschen. And I actually found from an old defunct website, but is still available on archive, web.archive.org, where you can find the whole quote. And I quote an extended block quote of this guy's insane Nazi rant, that quote comes from. You'll see that quote repeated all over the place, but the whole thing is really something. It's your typical, you know, fascist nonsense, really, like, but from a real true believer, so to speak, you know. And so, like, you know, there's certain to be trouble in the future. Anyway, I'm going to skip Trump, except to say that he was framed for Russiagate. None of it was true. None of it. And it was all made to prevent him from making peace with Russia. As the FBI themselves said to CNN, well, if we can't overthrow him through the 25th Amendment, at least we can rein him in and keep him from changing our Russia policy. The direct quote was the rein him in part. You can look that up, but they're clearly talking about his Russia policy. And so, as one of his guys told Keith Gesson in the New York Times Magazine, he said, Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. And so, you know, that's the story of Ukrainegate as well. As Alexander Vindman said, this guy's trying to change America's Russia policy. Well, we have a Russia policy. What the hell right does he have? Just because he's the one who won the election and is the only one who's allowed to sit in that chair behind that desk, who the hell is he to tell me, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, what America's foreign policy should be? He's got no right at all. We had a meeting of the interagency, and we decided. And so that's, you know, the way they saw it. That's what they mean by the deep state. And this is on Trump, by the way. And his enemies are sitting down the hall from him on his own National Security Council in his own White House. Whose fault is that, boss? But anyway, so Biden comes in, and here's how Biden causes the war, okay? Biden comes in, and he encourages Zelensky to clamp down on Putin's last best friend in Ukraine, a guy named Medvedchuk, who was the last like pro-Russian oligarch in the country who owned a big media company and all this. And Zelensky cracked down on confiscated all his property, shut down his TV station, and Biden applauded it. And I think that was probably the last straw for Putin right there. Maybe gave one more chance for diplomacy because they did meet that summer, but that was when Putin started building up forces and doing, you know, training exercises near the Ukrainian border. It was in the spring of 21. Then they met in July, and that went nowhere. Like, we don't know what really happened, but we know it was Joe Biden representing our side, and that nothing was accomplished in their meeting. And then at the end of the summer, and then he put out his, you know, threatening article, you know, his history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, where he's arguing that, you know, it was a mistake to let Ukraine go and we should take them back now. And then, so Biden's only answer to this, of course, is, well, he's Hitler, and so I got to be Churchill. Can never be Neville Chamberlain and appease an aggressor. You got to always stand up to the bully, never give him an inch, because you know what happens. If you give him an inch, they'll take a mile, and all this stuff. You got to punch the bully in the nose. And so, and especially the fact that he's 80-something years old at this point, and it's all Biden-supported policies from the late 1980s all the way through that has led to this point. You have no introspection at all, no like deep thinking at all. He's incapable of deep thinking at this point in his life. And so all he knows is, we got to be tough. So he instructs his government to be tough. So the State Department puts out a new statement outlining the next steps, reavowing that we are, in fact, going to bring Ukraine into NATO. I'm sorry, I skipped the Georgia War of 08. Well, I owe you one. And then he also has the Defense Department put out another statement saying that we're working further on expanding interoperability between our military forces and theirs, which means essentially making them a de facto member of NATO. It means we don't give them a war guarantee, but it means clearly, because we're essentially remaking their command and control, their communication systems, and their order of battle and everything, that this is so in case there's a war between NATO and the Russian Federation, Ukraine's military would be incorporated into the greater NATO army under Supreme Allied American Command, along with the Germans and the Hungarians and the Lithuanians and everybody else. So they're being made a de facto member of NATO, even though they're not getting a war promise from the US and the rest of the allies to come to their aid. They are being integrated as a potential part of an aggressive American force, or even a defensive one, whatever, but a force if a war broke out between NATO and the Russian Federation. So, and then and I had missed this, I got this late, and it's not in the book, but maybe in a later edition, I'll try to squeeze a sentence in there that there were British naval exercises also in October of 21 that were very provocative, and there were increased bomber flights, training flights. They're essentially practicing first strikes. They fly to 12.5 miles off of Russia's coast and then turn around and fly away. Testing their radars and that kind of thing. And then the Turks started pouring in new drones that they had just used effectively to help Azerbaijan take Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia. And then so they were pouring in these new drones for the Ukrainians to use in the fight with the so-called rebels in the east. And so at this point, Putin started building up his forces at the very end of October, beginning of November. And they sent Burns over there, and Burns said, he came home and said, Putin's going to war. We should like try to dissuade him, but there's no stopping him now. But then a few weeks later, the Russians introduced new treaties, one for NATO and one for the United States, where essentially they were reasonable treaties. And this was, you know, first of all, according to Biden administration officials, told the Post and the Times, these are reasonable proposals, negotiable proposals. They are not like ridiculous treaties, you know, written up with poison pills made to be rejected, like Madeleine Albright's supposed Rambouillet peace treaty that was really an excuse to start the Kosovo war. They said, no, these are reasonable. And I talked with Chas Freeman, who was a former ambassador to the Middle East and went to China with Nixon and all this stuff, an extremely experienced diplomat and intelligence guy, who said, no, this is absolutely a reasonable treaty. Doesn't mean we'd sign on the bottom line, but it means absolutely we could sit down and negotiate this. But Biden clearly had made the decision, him and his government had made the decision, we're not signing any new treaty. We might sign some new agreement. We could negotiate a little something or something, we'll see, but we're not signing anybody's damn treaty. That would be like Neville Chamberlain giving in to Hitler at Munich that one time. So forget that. So the argument was in December of 21 and into January and February of 22, the argument was, tell the Russians, you better not. And if you do, then we're going to pour in weapons to Ukraine and help them fight you. But that was it. They weren't willing to negotiate in good faith over these things. And what's really frustrating about this, and should be especially for people who are, you know, hardcore pro-Ukrainian partisans, you know, and I have my sympathies for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as well, that on the 30th of December of 2021, Joe Biden talked to Putin on the phone and said, look, Vlad, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO, not anytime soon. Not anytime in like the next 10 years. And you say you're worried that we're going to put these anti-missile systems in Kharkiv, you know, adjacent to Moscow. We're not going to do that. And Putin said, great, man. So just put it in writing then. Just put it in writing. And Biden goes, look, we'll work on it. And the thing is, that's true. Biden did not mean, okay, first of all, on the missiles, I never saw any indication that America intended to put missiles in Kharkiv. I mean, talk about a provocation. I don't think that there's any real reason to suspect that that was in the cards, although they were installing them in Eastern Europe, and just by, you know, on a theoretical basis, they sure could go ahead and do. You said you weren't going to move military equipment into the new NATO nations, then you did. Now you say you're not going to bring this equipment into Ukraine. Seems like you still might. Why not go ahead and sign a treaty and put it in writing? And as Derek Chollet, who was a State Department historian and a negotiator for one of the negotiators for the Biden administration, later said on a podcast, he said, we absolutely would not negotiate NATO. The only thing we would say about NATO is a defensive alliance. And that's it. And that'll be good enough for you. And if they say, well, but we say that doesn't matter, and we absolutely will not negotiate with you. And you can see how, you know, government employees, they do this weird little syllogism where, like, if you think of like government school teachers enforcing rules or whatever, where they're so rigid and they're not making sense anymore. So they build a little syllogism and they say, well, listen, if we were going to take Russia's security concerns into account and say that they're so worried about us bringing any country into NATO that then we wouldn't do it. Well, then what we're really saying is Russia has a veto over who we are allowed to bring into our alliance. Now, does anybody at the table agree that Russia should have veto power over our foreign policy and whether we should be able to bring someone into our alliance or not? And no one at the table is willing to raise their hand for that when you put it that way. And so they end up with this absolute idiot policy where they just like painted themselves into this corner where they say, listen, we have an open door. Now, there is no door. It's just jargon. It's a make-believe thing they made up in 1999. But that open door means that any country that wants to join NATO, they can if we say they can. It's up to NATO members only, led by the United States, and no third country's interests will ever be taken into account. Because if we did, then that would be the same as giving them veto power over all of our decisions, and we're not going to do that, are we? And so that's it. So that's the open door. And so, no, we absolutely, positively, no matter what, will not sign a deal or change Ukraine's constitution or make any further move to solidifying and putting in writing the idea that we are not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. This is, again, right after Biden just said, come on, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. What are you kidding? not like any time in the next 10 years. They're way too corrupt. Their economy, their democracy are way too corrupt to be part of NATO. They're lucky to get an association agreement with the EU. Give me a break, man. They wouldn't sign it because that would be Munich. And so they're willing to set Ukraine to war with Russia over the principle. That was ultimately what it came down to. Those were the two major outstanding issues: the ongoing civil war and the threat of America completing the integration of NATO into our military alliance. Now, one last anecdote, and we can talk about the war. I'll skip to the current negotiations, whatever. But at the beginning of the war, there was a reporter named Zach Dorfman writing for Yahoo News, who said he talked to CIA officers in Ukraine. They were the ones who were in charge of receiving the weapons and distributing them to the Ukrainian armed forces. And these CIA officers told Zach Dorfman that they had called the bosses back home and said, tell the politicians to call it off. We have miscalibrated our military transfers to Ukraine. We are not deterring Russia. We're just provoking them. We're not giving Ukraine enough military force and capability to make the Russians think, boy, we better not do it. We are giving them enough capability to make the Russians think, boy, we better do it now. If the storm's coming sooner or later, we better do it now before they get too much stronger. That's the position that we are putting them in. This is our own CIA officers told their bosses to tell Joe Biden, you've miscalibrated your calibration as far as this diplomatic language that you're trying to sell with these arms transfers and the message you're trying to send to Putin and your attempts to modify Vladimir Putin's behavior. They're not working. This is counterproductive. You're doing the wrong thing. But they didn't listen to that. And you have, the whole, was it the actor agent problem or whatever, the commander agent problem where, or the knowledge problem where the leaders of the policy back home are not getting the subtleties of what's taking place on the ground there. And so this is what led to war. And then the war's been an absolute catastrophe. As many of you know, they thwarted peace talks at the beginning of the war. I mean, the war was really made to force Kiev to the table in the first place. And then they came to the table, and it was famously the Ukrainians' proposal, the Istanbul communique was the Ukrainians' proposal that then they were tinkering with, but that was most acceptable to the Russians. And we all know the story. It was broken in Ukrainian media by pro-Kiev Ukrainian media, USAID backed Ukrainian media, Ukrainska Pravda, about how Boris Johnson came to town and threatened Zelensky that if you make peace with Russia, then you're going to lose all support from the United States and Great Britain. And so that's your choice, pal. And so that helped ruin the deal. And I don't know if you guys know this, but Boris Johnson did a podcast a few weeks ago where they asked him about this, and he made an excuse. He said, you know what? It wasn't me. It was the Ukrainian nationalists. They threatened Zelensky that he better not make peace. And the thing is, that sounds like a cheap excuse from Boris Johnson, the saboteur, but it also sounds like the truth too, because these Nazis have threatened to kill Zelensky, and before him, his predecessor Poroshenko as well, numerous times. They said as soon as he was elected, Beletsky said, if he tries to make peace with Russia, I'll hang him from the tree on Kramatorsk Street, or however you pronounce it, the main drag there in Kiev. I'll kill him myself, he said. At previous times, Dmitry Yarosh had threatened to shoot President Poroshenko if they were to dare to make peace with the Russians. And so that's Boris Johnson's new excuse, and I think I'm buying it, actually. Not that it really excuses what Boris Johnson did. He's responsible for his own position, but I bet you he's right that that's part of it, too. So then, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't want to go on too long about this, but the high point of the Ukrainians' effort in the war was in the fall of 22, when they seized back virtually all of Kharkiv province and half of Kherson. And it's been all downhill for them since then. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff warned the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, and then Mark Milley, the currently serving chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, look, this is as good as it's going to get. Quit now while you're only this far behind. And then we know now, we knew then at the time from, I forget what all reasons, but now we definitely certainly know from the New York Times major exit interview piece with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State. It's fittingly called Secretary of War because our chief diplomat, did everything he did to undermine diplomatic efforts to keep the war going as long as he could, to try to achieve a strategic defeat of Russia by extending the war longer. And so even though they knew that the Ukrainians were only getting further and further behind, and that their chances of being able to remove Russia from any further Ukrainian soil was getting, more and more difficult to imagine ever being possible, they didn't care. They didn't care how many Ukrainians died as long as Russians were dying too. And I have a whole series of quotes about this in the book, and there's just a new one from just a couple of weeks ago from Eric Swalwell, the Democratic representative, said the same thing. I'm sure many of you have heard statements like this from our politicians, from our military men, from our pundits on TV, especially from people like Lindsey Graham and other war hawks in the Congress. They say, we are getting such a great bang for our buck. We're killing Russians. We're sending Russians home in body bags. We're sending Russians home in coffins. We're getting Russians killed, and no American soldiers are dying. And they'll say this over and over and over again, many times, as including Eric Swalwell a couple weeks ago, completely excluding any mention, omitting any mention of the Ukrainian people at all. The Russian soldiers' lives have value to be degraded, and American soldiers' lives have value to be preserved, and the Ukrainians' lives aren't worth anything at all, not even a mention at all. Another example of this was David Ignatius, who's famously like the CIA ombudsman in the Washington Post. He said, this war has been great. We have inflicted such a tremendous cost on Russia in terms of rubles spent, in terms of their lives lost, and then look at the other side of the ledger. We've expanded NATO to include 2 new countries. We've forced all of the NATO European states to increase their defense spending and solidified the foundations of the alliance for another generation. It's been great for everyone. And then he says literally in parentheses, except for the Ukrainians, which at least he bothered to mention them at all. As I was saying, a lot of times they don't even get mentioned at all. They just say and by the way, the Washington Post is the best at this. When Russia spends money on war, it's sabotage. It's terrible for the economy. It's military Keynesianism. It's the most bankrupt, back-asswards way to run an economy that you could possibly imagine. Sure, it looks like they've got an increased aggregate demand now, but that's all debt spending, and it's all taxed money now being turned to weapons of destruction. And so it's a net loss for everyone, obviously. And then these same people, when they talk about war here, they go, well, this is increasing our defense industrial base. This is American jobs. And we're all benefiting so much from the war in Ukraine, which is obviously such a hoax. Yeah, it looks like an overall increase in aggregate demand, but it's just confiscating wealth, going into debt, printing money, and taxing people of real wealth to turn into weapons of destruction. It's an obvious net loss for everyone. And by the way, out of America and Russia, which is the one with the $36 trillion national debt? And which one do you think has spent more on the war in Ukraine? America or Russia? This is a strategic defeat, all right, and I'm sure to a great degree for them, but especially for us too. Which brings us to Trump, which I said I was going to hurry real fast and get right to Trump. And I didn't, but I tried. But Trump came in. I did skip the Georgia War of 08. But Trump came in and he came back. He clearly is sincere about wanting to end the war, but he's in a very difficult position. Ukraine is losing the war. Russia is ascendant on the battlefield. Tulsi Gabbard, the new director of national intelligence, they just put out the threat assessment 2 months ago that reaffirms that the Russians are kicking the Ukrainians' asses all up and down the line. They're winning the war. They forced the Ukrainians out of their salient that they had created in Kursk there late last summer, which lasted a lot longer than I thought it would, but the Russians finally went ahead and took care of that. And essentially, the line is more or less slowly, in some places more quickly, moving west. And the Russians are winning. And there's essentially nothing that Ukrainians can do to turn the tide the other way. So it's a long, hard slog, and a lot of Russians are dying too. I don't know if anyone can trust anybody's casualty numbers there, but clearly hundreds of thousands. pardon me, have been killed on both sides in the war. But if you take a measure of the incentives and all of that, Donald Trump really doesn't have much to threaten with. He could threaten to add more sanctions, but we tried that. And he could threaten to send in more weapons, but we tried that too. And so he could send in the 82nd Airborne, but I know he doesn't want to do that. And that would clearly escalate the war to a major power conflict. He's not interested in that. So what can he do? He can offer to the Russians to normalize relations. He can offer to lift the sanctions. I heard Witkoff, his special representative, ambassador at large, or their Secretary of State at large, saying that they have in mind some joint economic projects that we could do together with Russia, maybe American oil companies helping develop petroleum resources in Siberia or whatever, like it was in earlier days. Anything like that that we could do, that would be great. But that's all America really has to offer. Now, I sincerely hope and wish that the Russians would take him up on it. And I think if Vladimir Putin doesn't find a way to agree with Trump to end this war, it's going to be very bad. But the thing is, well, because he'll make a chump out of Trump, and he'll make a fool out of the idea that what you really should do is try to negotiate with these people who have reasonable concerns and things. If he keeps pushing, it'll look like it's just territorial expansion. So the thing is, he doesn't control all of Zaporozhye and Kherson. He controls virtually all of Luhansk and almost all of Donetsk. But Zaporozhye and Kherson, is about 50-50. And half of Kherson's on the other side of the river and not under Russian control at all right now. There's also the question of both of these cities. Kharkiv is formerly a Russian city, but it's an extremely important city. I don't know, truly how important it is to the Russians, but it was a Russian city long ago. And Odessa, of course, was as well, and is the jewel of the Black Sea, they call it. It's a major port, civilian port city there. And Ukraine's last port on the Black Sea, since the Russians now control the entire Azov coast there in Zaporozhye and Donetsk. And so Odessa's sitting right there. And it's also, by the way, just a little bit further to Transnistria, which is the small strip of Russian-controlled land on the Moldovan-Ukrainian border. So I don't know enough about this. I should look deeper into this, but certainly I know I've heard at least there's some of this, and I'm sure it's probably worse than I think, of right-wing pressure on Putin inside Russia to keep going and not stop until the Ukrainian military is destroyed and until Russia can take back Kharkiv and Odessa and cut rump Ukraine off from the Black Sea, make it a landlocked country, wholly dependent on the West. They have permanent enemies there, dominated by the, ethnic Ukrainian, far right-wing nationalists out of Lviv are going to dominate the Ukrainian government pretty much from now on, now that all pro-Russian people have been absorbed into Russia itself. So it would make sense from the Russian point of view that, nope, sorry, we've come this far. We're not stopping now, and keep going. But if they do that, it's bad timing with the Trump presidency, which is now new and was won on the promise that he was going to end this war. And so he would be making an absolute, ridiculous fool and failure out of Donald Trump's diplomacy, Donald Trump and his diplomacy, to screw him over now. So, I sure hope that Putin does the right thing for everybody involved and finds a way to wrap this thing up. And, there are hopeful signs. I mean, the reports are that he and Witkoff spent 5 hours together yesterday, and that Witkoff said at the end of the thing that, especially toward the end of the meeting, they really started making progress as to what would be acceptable conditions to call a real end to the war. So I do know that there are so few of us who care only and primarily about foreign policy and understand how crucial it is to the role of the United States government in our own lives and everybody else around the world as well. It's absolutely incumbent upon us to support Trump's behavior when he's doing the right thing in whatever way that we can, and making it known, especially for leftists and liberals here, making it known among your own group too, that this should absolutely be permissible behavior the same way as a good anti-interventionist right-winger supported Barack Obama when he finally got our troops out of Iraq before he sent them back 2 years later. So, and a lot of good libertarians and right-wingers supported Biden's decision to follow up on Trump's peace deal and get out of Afghanistan, even though, of course, he botched it and delayed the withdrawal by 4 months and caused a bunch of calamities on the way out the door. At least is absolutely the right thing to support calling off that intervention. So it's the same thing here. You know, Trump, he's really bad on a lot of things, and especially, of course, at its core, Zionism leads to terrible policy in Yemen and Iran and throughout, you know, America's relationship, especially with the Shiites throughout the Middle East and with the Palestinians as well. But at least on this is the one thing where at least his instincts are good. He really is trying to wrap this thing up, and there's got to be somewhere out in the country a chorus of support saying that yes, this is in fact what we want him to do, and to boast about that. See, I brought peace. That's what's good about me. When he could just say, well, I kill Islam's better than anybody else, or whatever would be the typical, you know, Republican garbage. He's not selling us John McCain. He's selling himself as the anti-McCain. So we ought to be taking him up on that, and we ought to be doing as best we can to positively reinforce his behavior when he's doing the right thing, in whatever ways we can, through writing and radio and political support and whatever we can. So with that, I'm sorry I went on so long. I promise not to, but that never works. But I'm happy to take questions for as long as you guys got them, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Scott. That's an awful lot of information there, a lot of background, and clearly we got to look at the book to
Oh, you know what I
to
should have
look
said?
a lot of the details.
The audiobook, I'm posting the audiobook on my Substack in you know, the Martyr Made serial podcast format there. And so it's so far it's 3 parts, H.W. Bush chapter and the Bill Clinton chapter in 2 parts. Just Bill Clinton is 8 hours long. So it's a big book.
Okay.
But
Great. So
that's all at
let's take a
scotthortonshow.com. If people
let,
want to listen to the audiobook, it's there.
we have about almost 10 minutes left. Let's see if anyone has any questions. If you do, use the react button, use the raise hand function on the react button to raise your hand.
I saw a lot of chat quotes going up there, but I couldn't read them while I was blabbing there. So I'm sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm trying to find the raised hands. Here we go. Let's go to Vincent DeStefano. Vincent, let Brian unmute you and you can talk.
Scott, that was terrific. Thank you very much. And as a dedicated leftist, I'm a person that agrees with your assessment on this. But my question is, you referred to the peanut gallery earlier, and that peanut gallery could encompass a lot of people. Why is it that we see the same voices recycled over and over again who have been wrong about everything? I mean, wrong about everything. We see them on the mainstream media. We see them rotated into government. They leave government. They go into private practice where they enrich themselves. Why do we see the same people over and over again?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about the neoconservatives, it's because that's what Israel wants, and that's what the arms industry wants. You know, I thought the great American journalist, or well, Irish American journalist Andrew Coburn, he says, you know, the neoconservative movement is best understood as a cross between the Israel lobby and the military-industrial complex. So, like, one way to think about it would be that, like, the old bankers and oil men had the Council on Foreign Relations, and they were basically all kind of a bunch of Brooks Brothers, waspy wasp types from that kind of previous era. And like at that time, I don't know if there were explicit quotas or what, but like there weren't that many Catholics and Jews allowed at the Council on Foreign Relations. It was really kind of a waspier thing than that. So you had a bunch of neoconservative, you know, war party intellectuals with no home. And then you had the new right military industrial complex, which is sort of this kind of new right-wing establishment that grew up post-war out west in Texas and Colorado and California and Washington State. And they needed their own eggheads to write the studies to justify their policies the way that the oil men had the CFR. And so what happened essentially was Lockheed and Northrop Grumman gave the Israel lobby a bunch of money. And the Israel lobby used it to set up all their own little CFRs. So that's where AIPAC set up the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. They took over the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, and then they set up the Project for a New American Century and the Center for Security Policy and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs and, Foreign Policy Initiative and probably 6 or 8 more. I can't remember off the top of my head. Jim Loeb is the greatest expert on this, everyone, by the way. And they just created their own establishment and their own echo chambers. And then because of the idiocy of American partisan politics, you can have someone who's just absolutely horrid, like Bill Kristol, David Frum, Max Boot, these guys who are just the absolute worst of the neoconservative sort of center-right during W. Bush. Well, they are just appalled by Donald Trump's manners, they'll have you know. And so then they turn coat and go back to the Democratic Party where they came from. That's what makes them neoconservatives in the first place, is they used to be, Trotskyite communists and Cold War Democrats. Now they're going back to the Democratic Party where they're greeted as heroes because, oh, that Trump is so bad that even Bill Kristol agrees with us about what a bad guy he is, all the center-left liberals say. And so then you have the very worst people in society, the very worst people on the center-right neoconservative war party, then become the leaders of the Democrats. And of course, with Russiagate was the worst because with Russiagate, you had the CIA and the FBI frame the Republican and give him the full Saddam Hussein treatment. So then in that case, you had the liberal Democrats then saw the CIA and the FBI and the national security establishment as their protectors from the horrible right-wing party that got elected that they hated and that they convinced themselves had stolen the election and all of that. So then instead of associating the national security state with the Republican they hate, the way they did during, say, the W. Bush years, now the national security state, they were the saviors protecting them from the guy that won the election. So liberals never loved government so much since the days of FDR, probably, right? As they did during the days of Donald Trump's first administration. And of course, the Russiagate thing also completely poisoned their entire head about Russia. Because even after Russiagate had all kind of fallen apart, they still had their hatred for Putin. And then when Trump was gone, Putin became their stand-in for Trump, this right-wing Christian who reminds them of their dad they hate or whatever their problem is. And so they still insisted had foisted Trump on the United States in this terrible Manchurian candidate coup thingy. So then when Biden is saying, well, we have to stand up to Russia over Ukraine, that was the Putin of their imagination that they were jousting with, was the Russiagate one who had inflicted Trump on us, rather than the real Putin who maybe would have been easier to negotiate with.
Okay, well, thanks, Scott. I think we might have time for one more question. Let's go to Susan Markowitz. Susan Markowitz, Brian.
Oh, I see.
Susan Markowitz is actually.
Oh,
it's
this
the guy in
is
the blue sweater.
okay.
Richard
This is
Kreshnick.
Richard Kreshnick under the name of Susan Markowitz.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I fixed your name for you, Richard.
I was recently listening to Ray McGovern, career senior CIA analyst for Russia of 60 years, who's my number one that I listen to on this stuff. And he's optimistic that Trump can reach an agreement with Trump because he does want to end the war. However, he doesn't understand the degree to which Russia is dominating the situation. He doesn't fully understand Russia's strong position and is not yet ready to give Russia everything it is asking for in Ukraine. And so the fear is that Ray McGovern and I share that when he fails to get what he would consider any meaningful concessions from Russia, that Russia will not give, that then he will flip and give up trying to end the war and give in to all the forces within the United States that want the war to go on. And Ray is also concerned that the real deep state, which is the military-industrial complex, essentially, will not allow Trump to succeed in giving Russia enough of what they want to actually end the war, and that they might even kill Trump, just as they killed John Kennedy when he decided to end the Cold War. That, in other words, because the same people you've been talking about that have been behind this all along, they're still there. And they still have the seats of power within the military-industrial complex. So how do you come down on this? Is the military-industrial complex going to allow Trump to give Russia enough of what they want that they will stop the war? Will Russia give in on one of their big demands that they don't have to because they're dominating the battlefield? How is this going to come out, do you think?
Yeah, well, like I was saying, I agree with Ray on that. As far as the difficulty in Trump being able to get a deal out of Putin here, and then the danger that then he'll go ahead and continue the war. I mean, right now he's still continuing arms shipments, as part of his negotiating strategy and all of that. So if the talks just completely fall apart and Putin makes it clear that, nah, he's decided he's going all the way to Transnistria if it takes him another 2 years or whatever it is, then Trump is going to react very badly about that. Like, I don't know really what he can do. I doubt that he's just going to turn his back and forget it anyway. I mean, that's my position, is forget it anyway.
Yeah.
The pressure on him, especially, personnel is policy, and he hired a bunch of Fox News Zionist hawks to run his government. And so the consensus in the room is going to be, we got to do something, boss. Most likely on all this stuff. And Vance is probably the best of them, and he's terrible, on a lot of this stuff. So, I think that's a real problem. As far as, will the military-industrial complex allow Trump to make a deal here? I think yes, but he better hurry. And he won this election so soundly and had such a mandate that it's not just the Democrats, it's the government that's demoralized. Like, at the end of the day, they try to frame him up and say that he was a Russian stooge and that Putin had stolen the election for him last time and all that. But we know that they were the ones who were cheating, trying to rig that election for Hillary by accusing him of being a Russian agent in the first place. That was the cheat. Then we also know, because it's admitted now, there's no covering it up, that they cheated in order to bury the Republicans' October surprise against Biden in 2020 and kick all dissent of Biden off the internet in the run-up to that election, to rig the election of 2020. And then here he won for the third time. He won. And against the establishment's consensus chosen pick to guide us. And what was Kamala Harris running as? She was running as Joe Biden. In other words, nobody thought she was really going to be calling the shots. She'd be like maybe sitting at the head of the table when they had a big group discussion about what we're going to do. But just like with Joe Biden, it was going to be Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan deciding what to do. And that was what she was running on. Like, don't worry, guys, it'll be the same crew that you already trust that's been in power for 4 years now. And people weren't going for that. People did not want that. So Trump won again. And so I think there, I hate to use this word. It sounds out of context. It sounds weird, but I think there's got to be a certain amount of respect for that process when he ran explicitly on bringing this war to an end. They're like, what are they going to do? They're going to frame him for treason again? As Ray said, they could kill him. I don't know if they really got the chutzpah to do that. Maybe they do. I think the Ukrainians may very well have been behind the attempt, the second attempt on his life. I don't know what the hell happened with the first one. But the second one, where the guy clearly was a hardcore pro-Ukraine partisan, had been filmed at an Azov battalion rally in Ukraine. I think there's every reason. And now they're saying, oh, you know what? Hey, if anybody listening to this, if anybody in the room here, if you know about this better than me, please chime in and fill me in. I only saw the headline. I did not get a chance to follow up on this. But did I read right? Does anybody know about this? Did I read right where they said in that story the other day about Ryan Routh, the guy that had the gun at the golf course down in South Florida, when they said he was trying to buy a surface-to-air missile from a Ukrainian. Did I read that right? That they said someone that he believed was a Ukrainian? In other words, the tell for an FBI informant? Does anybody know better about that? I shouldn't be bringing this up off the top of my head like this. I need to look that up, but I believe that the way I read it was like the tell that it was like an FBI informant that he thought was a Ukrainian arms dealer and that he was trying to get a rocket from, which would raise major questions then about how much heat that they had on this guy. They clearly knew that he was a kook. There was a lady that told the New York Times that she was a former CIA officer who was over there helping to coordinate some stuff, and how she reported him when she came home from Ukraine. The first thing she did was sit down and debrief the customs officials about this kook, Ryan Routh, that's over there. You need to look out for him and this kind of thing. And that they, apparently had ignored her. But I mean, that's one that is highly suspicious about who is, and the same thing for the Pennsylvania thing. I mean, we have essentially a giant blank spot for this kid's motive or any of the process by which, these shots were taken up there. I'm all for the local failure theory, but that doesn't explain who he was or why he was motivated to even try to take the shot in the first place.
Just as a heads up, Scott, that was actually confirmed by the Department of Justice, according to CBS News. So,
say that again. In other words,
that was confirmed by the Department of Justice, according to CBS News, in terms of the Ryan Routh seeking a surface-to-air weapon.
Oh, yeah, but no, the key is, tell me this, though, Brian. Does it say there from someone he believed was a Ukrainian? Or does it say from a Ukrainian that he was trying to buy the thing from? Because that, to me,
that's an interesting point. Yeah, no,
I mean, either way,
I'll have to look into that one.
Yeah, if it's from a Ukrainian, that's interesting. But if it's from an FBI informant, that's even more interesting. Hey, this guy's got his hand up here.
Okay, we're way over time, but let's take one more question. Which one do you want there?
Jeffrey Barkdahl has his hand up.
Jeffrey, go ahead.
Thank you. First off, both of the picking me and the presentation. I have three quick questions, real quick. I'm gonna make them very quick. Even if Trump does end the war, it won't make up for the fact that he's trying to destroy American democracy. Correct? That's number one. And number two, is this everything that you said? Is that why they sabotaged Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign to prevent him from becoming president? And number three, do you think you could share your contact with me so we could stay in touch? Because I'd like to learn more from you.
Sure. Okay, so yeah, I'm just Scott at scotthorton.org or Scott at antiwar.com. I'm easy to reach. You might want to read the book, and that'll get you good and caught up with everything I know. But as far as destroying democracy, I mean, look, that's what everybody always says about the candidates that they hate the worst. But the fact of the matter is that, short of bringing a real war to our shores, what FDR left of our Constitution will thrive, will survive. So we're going to still have regular elections for the House and the Senate every 2 and 6 years. We're going to still, all the 50 states and their constitutions are going to remain intact, and the Republic will survive Donald Trump. Short of a H-bomb exchange, we'll be fine. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. The worse damage he can do to the national government, the better. The Department of Education, USAID, and for that matter, a great many of the national government departments were created even post-Nixon, right? Like not even during FDR or Truman, but even, post-Eisenhower, post-Kennedy, post-Johnson, some of these departments is proof enough we don't need them, right? Even Whoopi Goldberg today, I don't know if you guys saw this, they cut quick to commercial when Whoopi Goldberg on The View said, well, screw the National Department of Education. I pay all my taxes on the state level to the schools. We just need to do a good job making sure the state and the local level take a good care of the schools. Why would we need the national government for that anyway? And then she goes, oh, I'm being told we're going to commercial now, because they don't want you questioning why do we have the national government do anything for us at all? In fact, if we abandon the world empire, I think you'd find that we don't even need a national government. Why? To destroy our currency, create a massive boom bust cycle every, you know, eight or 10 years and destroy the entire American economy, pull the rug out from under everybody, to frame people for ridiculous, you know, fake terrorist crimes and wage their horrific war on drugs and diminish the Bill of Rights and all of the things. I mean, we could absolutely do without them. So the less national government we have, the more democracy you can have in your own state, pal, and the more effect that you can actually have on the way things run, you know, close to you. I think that's, you know, and I just know that from my own personal experience from going down to the Texas state legislature. I know that, you know, me and small groups of organized people can have at least some kind of effect on the way things are done down there. Whereas we have no lever of power in Washington, D.C. whatsoever. As everyone listening to this call knows, Israel and Saudi and UAE and Qatar have more influence over American foreign policy than we do, right? England has a greater say in American foreign policy than the people of the United States. And for that matter, you know, on all these domestic questions, it's the major corporations and major interests are the ones who get to tell Congress what to do. Whereas on the state level, at least you'd have an opportunity to try to obstruct them. Is, you know, my overall decentralist libertarian take on power for you there.
Okay, well, we have a lot of issues that we could go into there, right, Scott?
Yes, we sure do.
Yes, we sure do.
I'll say this for all the liberals and leftists listening to this, you might not agree with us libertarians on anything except war, but here's one more thing for you to agree with us about. And that is the boom bust cycle. So like you could be all for welfare. You could be all for like whatever government interventions in the economy that you believe in and unions and whatever left-wing issues. I'm not taking any of those away from you, but I am saying it's just a factual fact that the reason the economy booms and busts all the time isn't because that's the wild excesses of free market capitalism. It's because the government prints money all day. And the people who get all that free money from the government invest it then in these giant bubbles that distort the economy and end up causing these very real crashes. And then what happens every time there's a crash? They go, oh, it's all freedom's fault. Now we need government to pass a new law and bail out banks and stimulate the economy, create even more money and do more of the same thing that they did last time. And the reason for that is because of inflationary money. That's what causes the boom bust cycle. Ludwig von Mises figured this out 104 years ago and wrote all about it. And again, you could still be a leftist and still be a liberal, and I wouldn't ask you to change your opinion on any other thing about economics or social policy or any other thing. But that's a very important gift to humanity from the Austrian school. This is what causes the boom and the bust. And the boom and the bust, admit it, is what makes you hate capitalism so much. The rich get richer and the poor get screwed because of the boom and the bust cycle. That's what it is.
Okay. Well, like I say, a lot of areas to pursue here. But Scott, we want to thank you so much for spending your evening with us, for sharing all this research and thinking that you've done on this situation on the Ukraine war. And at Mass Peace Action here, we will be continuing to push the idea that there must be a negotiated settlement to this war. It's time to end, and we're hoping that people out there will join us. I've put the link to our sign-up sheet to jump on board here in terms of pushing the idea of a negotiated settlement and no more escalations, and to take away that threat of nuclear war and to end this just disaster for Ukraine, as well as for all these Russian soldiers that are dying.
Yep.
So please join us in that effort. And Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you again, Paul, and everyone at your great organization here for having me.